Hello, everybody. I'd like to continue our treatment of early Greek philosophy with a presentation of some of the main ideas in the philosophy of Aristotle. We see a bust of Aristotle here along with his years, 384 to 322 BCE. It seems that his death in 322 kind of also marks the end of what we've been calling the golden age of ancient Greece. This is just a review that we presented previously, but just to reiterate, we began our introduction to philosophy with the Western philosophy with our look at the Greeks. We started with the pre-Socratics, the very first philosophers in ancient Greece. And then we moved on to the time of Socrates and the Sophists in the city of Athens. And then after Socrates, we've been looking at Plato and Aristotle. Last week we looked at Plato. This week we're going to look at Aristotle. And just again, I mean, in each stage of the development of philosophy, different questions are being asked and reflecting different interests of the philosophers of that time. And the first philosophers, we said, were doing what we called natural philosophy, explorations, trying to explain the natural world, trying to identify the basic elements and trying to explain change. Socrates and the Sophists in the next stage shifted their interest and their questions more towards the inner world of human beings and wanted to know what can we legitimately know, and in particular, what can we legitimately know about what the best kind of life is for human beings to try to live. So in the first stage of philosophy, you'd say the philosophers are interested in the external world. In the second stage, they're more interested in the inner world of human beings. And then when we talked about Plato and Aristotle, we just say here we get a kind of expansion of the scope of philosophy, and to the point where it includes the full range of possible philosophical questions. And we said that Plato offered a complete kind of systematic view of this whole range, and Aristotle is going to do the same. Wanted to revisit once again the site for the activities of Aristotle and Plato and also Socrates, and that's in the city of Athens. And this again is a rendering. I think the artist is Lee Van Klins, a kind of rendering of the Acropolis, and it's just a kind of inspiring picture, and which captures something of the atmosphere within which these philosophical activities were taking place. I thought it would be interesting to include some biographical information about Aristotle. He certainly had an interesting life. He was born in Stagira, which was in northern Greece, and it looks as though his father was a physician in the court of King Philip II of Macedonia. Aristotle's parents died when he was just 13, and I think a guardian was appointed to look after him. At the age of 17 or 18, he went to Athens, south to Athens, and joined Plato's academy, Plato's school. And he continued his studies there for the next almost 20 years. Now that's a long time to be in school, you might say, and but clearly Aristotle was developing his own interest as well as learning whatever Plato could teach him. He stayed there, and until maybe I think I got here 348 when Plato died. There's one of the stories is that Aristotle was the most prominent student in that school, and might have expected to be put in charge after the death of Plato, but for some reason or political reason or other, one of Plato's nephews ended up running the school. In any case, Aristotle left Athens. He'd been invited to go back to Macedonia by King Philip and tutor the young prince, Prince Alexander, who would later become Alexander the Great, one of the first world conquerors, you would say. And he continued there until maybe 335, so that's a little over 10 years. And then he returned to Athens and established his own school, which was known as the Lyceum. Eventually, there was some conflict between Macedonia and the rest of the Greek states. And we'll see that Alexander probably plays some role in that. But when there was anti-Macedonian feelings in Athens against Macedonia, and Aristotle was afraid that he might be persecuted as a result of it, so he left the city again and went back to Macedonia. In one of his famous quotes, "Lest Athens sin twice against philosophy," as they had done with when they executed Socrates. So he ended his days in Macedonia. But when we said that both Plato and Aristotle expanded philosophy to its full extent, and that's certainly the case in terms of the material that was left behind. And Plato's body of work consisted mostly of these dialogues that we talked about, and we said that maybe there were 24 of these dialogues, dramatic presentations of philosophical discussions. And it was said that Plato also had, the dialogues were intended for public consumption, so they were like a dramatic form and kind of more readable than lecture notes or something like that. And that Plato also would have had lecture notes, but somehow they were all lost in time. It was just the opposite was the case with Aristotle. So apparently Aristotle also wrote dialogues, dramatic presentations of ideas and conversations, but none of those have survived. But what we do have of Aristotle are his lecture notes, or notes that his students compiled, and it's a pretty extensive body of work. So you get an impression of two really different kinds of writers, but it may just be that a lot of the difference has to do with the kinds of materials that have come down to us in history. Aristotle was clearly more interested in the sciences, and although he studied with Plato all those years, when he separated from Plato, he really concentrated more completely into the kind of natural sciences. And the list is pretty impressive, so which I've provided here. And that includes physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, and politics. And that Aristotle laid the groundworks for all these different disciplines, many of which didn't even exist, before uh, his work. And his work was really considered the authority in these uh, natural sciences, maybe you would say. I mean, for a very long time, for almost 2,000 years, it's hard to imagine that if people going forward for almost 2,000 years would look to Aristotle's writings as a guide to how you should pursue these different scientific interests, physics, biology, zoology, all these different things. It wasn't until the scientific revolution, the Renaissance scientific revolution, maybe Protestant Reformation and so forth, that the Aristotelian way of doing science was replaced by more modern approaches to science. So it's a pretty impressive legacy. I'd asked the class to watch a video on Raphael's School of Athens, the Renaissance painter, and famous mural in the Vatican. I think it was a smart history video, and in that video provided a pretty good way of contrasting who Plato was and who Aristotle was, and how their philosophies differed from each other. So in a way, they really give us two different alternatives on how to think about things. And so it's interesting to contrast them. Uh, to begin with, if we talk about Plato, and it seems fair to characterize Plato as an idealist. And for him, the most real things were the forms. And the forms weren't physical things, they were intelligible entities, and they existed in a world beyond the world that we're familiar with, the world that we live in. So somehow everything comes from this higher realm, and the forms. And so that's kind of what Plato is aimed at all the time, is trying to understand these forms. In order to have knowledge about things, you have to kind of move beyond the sensible world, the physical world that we live in, into a kind of world that's behind the physical world that kind of explains it. So he's kind of otherworldly oriented. You could say that's certainly different from Aristotle's approach. In the video or in the School of Athens, you see Plato has his right hand sort of pointing upwards, indicating that's where we should look to understand things. Aristotle, on the other hand, has his hand pointed, his hand, stretched out right in front of him, kind of to indicate that, look at this world. This is the world. In order to understand this world, look more closely at this world. So we call Aristotle a realist. And for him, his primary focus was always in trying to understand the world that we actually live in, and not trying to look beyond it or behind it. You can say, and I'll do this, give another way of looking at this in a few moments, but for Plato, the forms were considered more real than particular things. In our last video, we showed we tried to illustrate the Plato's divided line and say that there's a kind of hierarchy of being from the lowest kinds of things to the highest kinds of things. And the forms are always the most real kinds of things. Particular things have a lesser degree of reality. They are what they are because in some sense they participate, the forms participate in them. For Aristotle is going to disagree with that, and for him the most real things are always particular things. And, you talk about the form of a table, but an actual table, in front of you has more reality than the idea of a table for Aristotle. Again, you sort of want to understand what a table is, you look at real tables. So Aristotle gives us more of a kind of scientific way of looking at reality. And it looks like, it's hard to say that Plato was religious, but there is a kind of emphasis on spirituality, or this idea that there's an invisible world, which is the higher world where everything comes from. So you could say his philosophy looks as though it tends more naturally towards religion. So you get science and religion. In Plato, you can see some of the ideas, the impact of his distinction between physical reality and intelligible, the things of the mind. And for him, like when you try to leave the cave, you're trying to leave the physical world, so that, which kind of means you're trying to purify yourself, separate yourself from your sensations, so that you can understand things more clearly with just the mind by itself. And for him, that means the mind is like the things that it's trying to understand. The mind is an intelligible thing. And just as the forms can exist separately from the real things, from the actual things, so the soul in a human being can also exist separately from its bodily dwelling. You can see the consequences of that. That means, these ideas of the immortality of the soul, or the soul might live on after the death of the body. That seems to be part and parcel of Plato's way of looking at reality. In Aristotle, it's a little more complicated. For Aristotle, is going to say that all real things, all particular things, and human beings too, are like composites. Yeah, body and soul, they kind of go together, but they can't exist. You could say a body might exist without a soul, but you would say that a soul, it doesn't appear as though a soul can exist unless it's combined with a body. So again, this idea of understanding things, and you say, in both cases, it's all about trying to understand the truth of the world that we live in. And so you say we're similar to what it is that we're trying to know. So we're not trying to know ideal entities and so forth. We're trying to know things that have a real existence, have a body mixed with form. And that's our nature as well. We have a body and we have a form, but they're composites. They're not sort of separable. That means that life after death becomes more questionable. I can't swear that Aristotle ever says definitely that there's nothing lives on after the death of the body, but it certainly seems more difficult to arrive at. I don't want. It's easy to draw all the contrast, and we do it all the time. Uh, the differences between Plato and Aristotle, but I think you should also acknowledge the extent of the agreement between them. I mean, it was Aristotle was definitely influenced by Plato and his ideas. He didn't agree with the forms and ideas like that, but the way of doing philosophy, the way of trying to live rationally, uh, and the ideal of having a kind of contemplative sort of life, that was the best kind of life that a human being could have. The life of the mind was more important than anything else. And you could say ultimately the life of philosophy. Both Plato and Aristotle would have agreed on those points. And so they didn't disagree on everything, although they disagreed on a number of things. A lot of the differences between Plato and Aristotle seem to revolve around uh, differences in how you think about forms. And so this is another way of pursuing that a little bit better. One of the kind of famous things in Aristotle is his critique of Plato's theory of forms. It's not, some academics would say it's not clear that Plato, throughout the entire uh, length of his career, believed the same thing about the forms, or that he may have thought differently about the forms towards in his later period. But that we don't know about. We just have what has been presented to us in most of the dialogues. But Aristotle was very sort of keen, kind of critical, analytic mind. So for him, the first uh, criticism he leveled against Plato in the theory of forms was he said that Plato never really explained the relationship between the forms of things and particular things. So you're talking about an intelligible form, and somehow it's related to particular things that are named after that form, like beautiful thing and the idea, the form of beauty itself. Plato uses the term participation, but Aristotle points out that that's a nice term, but it doesn't really explain how an intelligible thing, a thing without any bodily existence, can be related to something which has a bodily existence. So participation, just to give a good name to something, doesn't really explain the basis of the relationship. We'll look at this. There's an example on our next page that we'll visit after this list. So that's one thing. He never thought that Plato was able to explain the relationship in a satisfactory way. Secondly, and this is pretty key for Aristotle, is that all this emphasis on forms and trying to understand the forms of things makes it difficult to appreciate sort of concrete reality. If, as is indicated, Plato is always trying to look above, look to a realm beyond the realm that's right in front of us, that it makes it difficult to appreciate the things that are right in front of us in concrete reality. And that's really Aristotle's tendency is scientific. He wants to try and understand what's right in front of us. So why look beyond it in order to try and explain it? Why not explain it in terms of itself? So Plato, looking above all the time, sort of kind of blinds him to the world which is right in front of us. It's kind of like thinking about being focused on the kingdom of heaven, the perfect realm that you might get to after you die, and you don't enjoy the world which is right in front of you while you're still alive. Lastly, and this is also a significant point for Aristotle, is that the forms, although they might explain something about how we talk about things, and say that it's useful to understand the idea of beauty when you're referring to beautiful things and so on. But one thing that the forms don't explain is how things change. So you can say there's a beautiful person, a beautiful flower, or a beautiful sunset, and so forth. But the form doesn't account for the fact that something becomes beautiful and then it loses its beauty. So, and that's sort of our reality is changing in front of us all the time. And the forms don't seem to help us very much in explaining the world of change. Here I'd like to revisit this slide or this image that we used in our Plato presentation when we were talking about the form of beauty and how it's related to the particular things that we might call beautiful, like Daenerys Targaryen, or the rose, or a sunset, or a sunrise. And to illustrate a little bit how Plato and Aristotle, the differences in terms of how they see this. And in a way, I think you could say that Aristotle really kind of flips Plato on his head, where he turns him over, because he sees things almost just exactly the opposite of the way Plato seems to see them in terms of what the most real kinds of things are. We said when we talked before about this for Plato that for him, the form beauty is because it's kind of a timeless, it's a timeless truth about things that are beautiful. Beauty itself, beautiful things change, but beauty itself never changes. So for Plato, that kind of represents truth. I mean, you need to know the idea of beauty in order to understand beautiful things. So for him, the form of beauty is really the highest kind of entity, something which exists in the highest degree. And so forms are really the most real things for Plato. And then likewise, particular things always have a lesser degree of reality because they're always changing. They're this and then they're that and so forth. So they exist in the world of becoming for Plato. It's like the forms exist outside the cave in a kind of ideal reality. Particular things exist in the cave, and they're definitely a lesser degree of reality. So particular things are always have less reality than the forms of things. So for Aristotle, it's just the opposite. For Aristotle, the most real things that have the most reality, are particular things. Things that have a mix of both form and matter together. It's like you could say these pictures, the rose, the sunset, the beautiful woman, that they have more reality than any idea that's associated with them. Aristotle doesn't deny that you can look at the form of something by itself, but when you do that, you kind of have to abstract it from the particular thing. So there is such a thing as beauty, like a form of beauty, but it's an abstraction, and because it's an abstraction, it's less real than any particular thing which you might call beautiful. It's like uh, the idea of a desk is less real than some particular desk that my computer's sitting on at the moment. So he turns this conception of what the most real kinds of things are is just the opposite of what Plato argued. Aristotle's way of trying to understand what the truth of things was pretty different from Plato's. You say it was more of a scientific approach. For Aristotle, and before you could say that you understood something or some particular thing, he felt that you should be able to identify all the different senses in which that thing is caused. And Aristotle thought that there were four causes or four questions you needed to be able to answer about something before you could say that you understood what it was. The first of these was the material cause. So in order to understand something, you should know what it's made out of. What's the material basis of it? We'll give an example of these on the next slide. He does list here a formal cause, and this is Plato's term, formal, but for Aristotle, this is just one among other causes that you need to understand. And in a way, the formal cause, it tells us what a thing is. You could say it's the shape or the structure of something, but it might mean more than that as well. Anyhow, first you have the material cause, what something's made out of. Second, you have a formal cause, which identifies what a thing is. Thirdly, there had to be an efficient cause. And the efficient cause would tell you how something came into existence, how it came into existence, what directly brought it into being. And we'll look at that as well. So something more immediate. And the last cause, or final cause, and the Greek term here is telos, the final cause, has a number of different meanings. But Aristotle felt that before you could say that you understood something, you should be able to identify what its purpose is. So telos would mean purpose. It could also mean function, like what a thing is supposed to do. It could mean end, in the sense that what is something directed towards? What's its end? What is it moving towards? Or what's the aim of a thing? All these, the word telos suggests, that you're trying to answer a kind of why question. Efficient causality tells you kind of how something came into existence. Final cause, telos, sort of kind of answers the why something exists the way that it is. So we'll look at some examples, and maybe that'll help illustrate these a little bit. This is an example that you could use to explain the four causes. I can't remember exactly if this is the one that's in our textbook that's suggested, but it might be. Anyhow, I'll put a picture here of Michelangelo's famous statue of David in all his nakedness. And so you say, okay, this is a famous statue. So you want to try and understand what it is. What's its material cause? You say it's made out of marble. And what is it? It's a statue of David. And it's Michelangelo's vision or version of the biblical figure David. How was it brought into existence? What's the efficient cause? You say, well, the artist made it, or more technically, you could say the artist made it through his the use of his chisels, his hammer and chisels, on the stone and sort of carved this image. And that's how it came into existence. You say finally, why did he make it? It was made to be an object of beauty for people to enjoy, for aesthetic appreciation, a beautiful object. So then that gives you some application, of these four causes. You can see that really the ideas here, and this especially the idea of a final cause or a telos, is easier to apply to things that are man-made. A statue, or you could say a bread knife and stuff like that. They were made for a certain reason. And so in order to understand what they are, you have to understand what the function of it is. So in order to understand a bread knife, you know what it's made out of, you know what its form is, you know how it came into existence. And then you have to know what its function is. It's supposed to cut bread and stuff like that. So answering these four questions works pretty well with man-made things. But Aristotle would have argued that these questions also can be asked about things in the natural world, that they also have a material nature, a form, and how they came into existence, and also a kind of purpose or function or aim, in that you need to be aware of in a way. He uses like what would be if you take an example of an acorn, for instance, which is one that Aristotle uses, you would say it's contained within the acorn. Its end is to become an oak tree, that there's something in the acorn that moves it towards the realization, to actualize a kind of potential that exists in itself in order to, when it's fully developed and has the right conditions and so forth, it'll become an oak tree. So Aristotle believed that in everything there's something within its nature that you need to be aware of in order to understand sort of what it is. Just like you could say a boy is potentially a man. I mean, a boy is a boy, but he's on the way to becoming a man. So you need to be aware. In order to understand what a boy is, you have to understand not only his material, his form, how he came into existence, from his parents and so forth, but what he's aiming at, or what his end is, to become a fully developed human being. This is our last slide. I thought I'd comment on this at least. And you say that Aristotle, not just Aristotle, but most of the ancient Greeks assumed that there were natural purposes, that everything had a natural purpose. So you can say it's a teleological assumption that everything in nature is what it is because it fits in with other things, or it has a sort of natural function, a reason why it is what it is. The exception to that would have been Democritus and the atomist, I would say. They wouldn't have assumed teleological assumptions. So you get a distinction, or it's useful to be aware of this distinction between teleological explanations and what we would call causal explanations. Teleological explanations assume that everything has a purpose within its nature, or that it is what it is because it has a job to do, a natural function, or something that it aims at, in order to be. And that, you need to be aware of that. You could say within a human being that almost everything, you say, what's the purpose of a human heart, for instance? You say, well, the purpose of a human heart, the function of a human heart is to circulate blood throughout the human organism. So you say the heart has a job or to do with respect to the whole person, and that identifies its function. So it has a kind of telos, which is related to how it fits in with the greater whole that it's a part of. So so this is an assumption that everything in nature has uh, a kind of telos contained within what it is. And this is really on, the focus is on trying to say why something is what it is, or help us understand what something is. And it seems as though this would assume a kind of divine plan and of some sort. If you want to say that everything has a reason why it is what it is and it fits in with everything else, it could be that this is connected with the idea of a creator who made everything be in accordance with a rational scheme and so forth. I'm not sure that that was what Aristotle had in mind. I mean, it may be, and I'm not sure that teleology is confined to that kind of necessity. But it is a popular view that, like, if you don't believe in a god or intelligent design of some sort, it's that kind of goes hand in hand with teleological explanations. A more strictly scientific explanation of things, you would say, is a causal explanation. And causal explanations don't assume that there's a purpose in things. It doesn't look for purposes. Instead, this approach confines itself to focusing on how things come to be what they are, or how things happen, or how they work. As I said before, that's like, I think that's what Democritus would have argued, a case like that as well. Anyhow, it's an interesting distinction, and it seemed pretty common that the Greeks did assume that everything had within itself some sort of purpose, and that part of your goal in trying to understand things should be to identify what the purpose or the function or the telos of something might be.